For as long as I can remember, the topic of how things should be pronounced is something that's been ever present. And that's before even taking a deeper look inside the permutations of this topic that have been created by the video games industry. One of which is the rather heated debate about whether it should be TIEdus or TEEdus, which we're going to delve into later. Now, to give some context to this rather specific debate around a Final Fantasy protagonist, we have to start right at the top of the funnel. Universal words such as water, either, and often are frequently pronounced differently depending on where you're from in the world, and that's before we even get onto more specific things like herbs and rooters. It's such a prevalent topic that a few years ago it was one of the viral trends on YouTube, and prominent creators like Markiplier still go back to this topic because it's such an emotive one. If we do then bring video games and other fantasy mediums like books into the equation, then it opens up the discussion even more, and in some ways makes it much more personal. Outside of featuring traditional words that you'd find in the Oxford English Dictionary, these mediums go further by introducing lots of places, enemies, and characters with made up names. Sometimes they'd even just feature uncommon things that still nobody would know how to say correctly, except maybe the creators and those who were slightly more in the know. I mean, despite Hermione being an actual name with a correct way of it being pronounced, how many of you ever heard the name being pronounced as Hermione when Harry Potter was in its infancy? Needless to say, if people wanted to talk about and discuss anything that was happening relating to these properties with their friends or family, then they would have to rely on their own interpretation of the words that they were seeing. And this would then be based on their own interpretation of the language that they would speak natively. I can remember numerous instances of this at school where either myself or my friends would try to talk about a specific enemy we had encountered, but whoever started the discussion would just pronounce the enemy's name in a way that was different from what was expected. One of the classics here is what I would still call Bahamut. But was it Bahamut, Bahamut, or Bahamut? Nobody knew the actual answer at the time, but we'd often just decide on the correct version based on a majority vote on which one sounded the least stupid to us. With the older games, this often ended up being a regular topic of discussion, as they were all text-based. For example, if you're just looking at Final Fantasy VII in isolation, there have been debates around how you pronounce tons of different characters, enemies, and gameplay elements. To name just a few, is it Sephiroth or Sephiroth? Is it Tifa or Tifa? Is it Yuffie or Yuffie? And one of my favourites, is it Red 13, Red X, or Red XIII? There were of course the customary debates about how you'd say the names of each of the summons, but it also extended to things like how materia should be pronounced. With the emergence of voice acting in the early 2000s within the Final Fantasy franchise, you'd have thought that these kind of debates would have been resolved. And in many ways they were, as we got to hear how things should theoretically sound in the eyes of the creators. But it's also turned the topic of how things should be pronounced into a rather prickly subject too. Many people, and I'd still include myself here in some instances, couldn't and still can't help but cling on to the way they had pronounced things for years and years prior to hearing it for the first time in a game. And even with the introduction of voice acting, that still hasn't changed different interpretations, as people just forget. I mean, is it Balthier or Balthier? And then there's just the general lack of consistency that Square Enix present themselves. Let's look at Bahamut as a more detailed example. If we're going by its etymology, then according to Wikipedia, it's based on a gigantic fish that appears in Muslim storytelling. And this particular Bahamut was pronounced Bahamut and was transcribed as such by an English scholar called Edward Lane. The Japanese translation of the word, which appears in the games, is also Bahamuto, which is consistent with this. It wasn't until 2006 that a Final Fantasy game would actually feature a character saying this particular word though, and this was Ash in reference to the Arcadian Sky Fortress during an epic sequence that took place in the final moments of the game. She pronounced it Bahamut, but the issue it created was that this may or may not be how the summon was also pronounced, as, well, they are two entirely different things. Now, it could be assumed that they are indeed both distinct references to the mythological creature from which the word spawned, and you would probably be right in that assumption, as many of the other airships were based off of summons too. But that's all it is, an assumption. And when Final Fantasy XV reared its head, the argument was burst wide open, because they reverted to the way that I personally pronounce it, Bahamut, which suggested that the Sky Fortress Bahamut perhaps did just have a unique way of being pronounced. Now, this might all sound rather pedantic, but given how much negative vitriol I've received personally for years on how I've pronounced things, I felt it was important to actually delve into this topic and have a debate, especially when there are even instances where basic English words have been changed for the purposes of Final Fantasy games. Just look at the most recent main release again, Final Fantasy XV. When they announced Gladiolus' sister, there was surely only one way that could have been pronounced right. Wrong, as instead of calling her Iris, they decided to call her Iris, as in Japan they pronounced the singular vowel I as E. Aranea is another one that caused a lot of confusion with Latin speakers, as it's an actual Latin word meaning spider, but they decided to go with Aranea instead of Arania. To highlight though, they are well within their rights to do so as the creators of the projects, and it makes sense to do so if they are consistent with this approach. As soon as I found out the correct way to say Iris and Aranea, I obviously changed my approach, but it's the lack of consistency that makes things confusing. For example, why did they decide to localize Sydney to Cindy, but not provide localized names for Iris and Aranea? Then we get on to the general lack of consistency within the games themselves. Let's look at two specific cases in Final Fantasy XV and Final Fantasy Type 0 HD. Ramuh is pronounced in different ways throughout Final Fantasy XV, and neither of them match what I personally would consider to be the more logical approach. So here, you can see that Gladiolus referred to him as Rama,
First Titan, now Rama. Chasing down deities is hard work.
while Talcott referred to him as Ramuh.
Ramuh passed judgment on people who didn't repent by smiting them with a bolt of lightning.
Which is how he was actually referred to in his first Final Fantasy voice acting appearance, which was in Final Fantasy XIV.
I am Ramuh, guardian of the children of the forest.
Now there's a case for all forms, as Ramuh could be based on Lamu, a bearded deity from the Mesopotamian era, or it could be based on Rama, the protagonist of an epic Hindu poem. In Type 0, there was also confusion around the teacher of Class 0. Is it Kurasame or Kurasame? Both variants are heard throughout the game, and it makes it difficult to determine which is the correct one.
I am now your commanding officer, Kurasame.
We all know that the Ice Reaper is a broken vessel. The best Kurasame can do is pass on his knowledge.
But anyway, before I get too carried away with all of these examples, as there are so many, let's get on to the actual point of this video. We've covered a decent number of characters in our Origins series, but so far the core characters have had pretty universally accepted ways to pronounce their names. Sure, I've been called out on some characters who have appeared as part of the wider tales, but by and large, people haven't burst any blood vessels yet. We're getting to the point though where a certain protagonist from Final Fantasy X is going to be the subject of an upcoming Origins video, and even though blood vessels will most certainly be burst when it's published, I wanted to make sure how I end up pronouncing his name is something of a discussion. So with that, is it TIEdus or TEEdus? To preface the rest of the video, I have always personally preferred TIEdus, and I've never actually met anyone outside of some Square Enix employees who have called him TEEdus, so for now, I will refer to him as TIEdus while I delve into why it's such a controversial topic and why it's still even up for debate. Unlike many of the other characters who have appeared in the voice acting era, TIEdus was never referred to by name in Final Fantasy X, and this is because he's actually the last main protagonist in an offline game that you could assign a custom name to. Based on this, the decision was also made not to have anyone speak his name in X-2 either. It therefore led to two schools of thought being created. One where it should be based on a comparison to other English words, and another where it should be based on how it was pronounced in the Japanese version of the game. Now, interestingly enough, there's actually no word in the English language that starts with TIDU, so it led to comparisons with words starting with TID instead. In isolation, TID would most likely be pronounced as Tid, but there are only a few words like tiddlywinks that actually start with that sound. Most of the words like tide, tidal and tidy start with the tide sound. Therefore, the way it would naturally be interpreted as an English speaker, to me, was TIEdus. And when you throw in the connection with the sea and the tide, this also made some sense. In terms of other points of reference, well, there's a character in LEGO Elves called TIEdus, and there's also a hip-hop artist called TIEdus, but these are of course separate from the Square Enix interpretation, and they therefore aren't bound by the same rules. Using the Japanese school of thought though, it's all rather different. The creators of Final Fantasy X have noted that the character is based on the sun, while Yuna is based on the moon. And in the Japanese version of the game, he is therefore called Tida, which means sun in Okinawan. And if they'd actually called him Tida in the English version and kept it consistent with the other Japanese-centric names like they did for Yuna, Lulu, Waka, Riku, and Kimari, then I feel as though I would have naturally just called him Tida. But for some reason they didn't. They chose to localize the name and created this strange situation that has led to his name being pronounced in different ways. Now, as a segue here, localizing names does happen. We've already mentioned Sydney and Cindy, but with main protagonists there are other examples. You've got Final Fantasy V's Bartz, who is called Butts in Japan. Then there's Final Fantasy VI's Terra, who is called Tina in Japan. Outside of English, it does happen too. For example, Zidane isn't called Zidane in the French version of Final Fantasy IX. They wanted to avoid comparisons with Zinedine Zidane, one of the most famous French footballers of all time who had won the World Cup with France 2 years before Final Fantasy IX released. In that market, he is therefore called Zidane. Anyway, getting back to TIEdus, it was revealed last year by James Arnold Taylor that there wasn't actually a whole lot of thought put into how its name should be pronounced outside of Japan. After producing a new trailer for the game before it was out, they hired an American voice actor who was based in Japan to narrate it.
A young adventurer named TEEdus.
And after hearing how he pronounced the name, they just assumed that he was saying it correctly and decided to just roll with it. James Arnold Taylor heard this story from the production crew and then decided to pronounce it in the same way for the documentary that was bundled with the European version of Final Fantasy X. When TIEdus then had his name said in an official capacity for the first time during one line of dialogue in Kingdom Hearts, it was said by D. Bradley Baker as TEEdus.
Me and TEEdus, we are gonna do a little exploring today.
But when his name was pronounced in Kingdom Hearts 2, he was called TIEdus.
Tidus and Waka are all wrapped up in their ballgame, and they won't go with me.
Presumably, Molly Marlette, who voiced Selphie in Kingdom Hearts 2, felt it made more sense, and wasn't corrected by the director when she said it. Since then though, he has had his name pronounced as TEEdus in Dissidia, World of Final Fantasy and the Final Fantasy X audio drama, which has confirmed Square Enix's official stance. But even some Square Enix employees don't find it all that natural to say TEEdus. They sometimes slip up on live streams and interviews calling him TIEdus instead. It's therefore created, as I said, a very weird situation, and that's why I wanted to present the information in this way, so it's easier to understand how these kind of situations arise and how Square Enix generally feel about this stuff. Given the indecision they often have, I'm inclined to go along with the sentiments of James Arnold Taylor. He stated that while he has a preference for TEEdus because it makes the name sound more interesting, how people pronounce the name ultimately doesn't really matter. It's no different from the whole tomato-tomato debate. Everyone knows what you're talking about. However, as we're going to be working on TIEdus for a future Origins video, we wanted to make sure that if there was a more general swell in favour of TEEdus now, that I'm not going to unnecessarily antagonize people because I think that saying TEEdus sounds kind of weird. So based on that, please do let us know in the comments how you pronounce his name, and how you feel about this whole topic in general outside of the differences between TIEdus and TEEdus. And as always, if you enjoyed this video and found the information interesting, please feel free to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, especially so you don't miss out on our future Origins video. Also, if you'd like to join our growing community, why not check out our Discord server? There's a link in the description below. why not also consider supporting us on Patreon? You get the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping to support us in the creation of these videos, and you will be rewarded by, amongst other things, getting your name at the end of videos like these amazing guys you're seeing right now. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I will see you next time for more Final Fantasy videos.